Welcome to another edition of Inside the War Room. Ryan Ray here as always. I've recorded this intro, I don't know how many times, but every piece of recording equipment I have, it's not syncing the audio. Oh, it's been a nightmare. So I'm going to make it short. There is a reason for this. If you listen to the audio version, it's more in depth, but I'm not saying the same thing for the 15th time, so I'm going to cut it short. Three things. One, today's topic is sensitive in nature. We talk about the Penn State sexual abuse scandal. So if you got sensitive ears around, you might want to tune that off. Two, the Ryan Recommends segment is coming back as I promised. Here it is, China's Civilian Army by Peter Martin. Fantastic book. Go check it out. Three, sponsor is Bluehost, RyanRaySenior.com/hosting. Go get your hosting there. If you do, send me a screenshot. Emails below. Send me a screenshot, and I will make sure that we plug your domain on this podcast, the audio, the video, wherever. Final thing is, John Ziegler is our guest today. He is a columnist for Mediate and the co-host of With the Benefit of Hindsight podcast. It's over 50 hours breaking down the Sandusky thing. It's unbelievable, all the stuff he has. I think John does a great job of going through and parsing through the data. I might do a follow-up podcast on my thoughts on his podcast on warroommedia.com. I don't know warroommedia.com, on this War Room Media YouTube channel. I'll probably do that. So with that being said, John Ziegler, link to his Twitter below. Thank you, John, for coming on. Fantastic job on the podcast. Let me know what you think at the end about John's claims, my claims, how we interpret the data. And oh, by the way, did Epstein kill himself? John, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I've been pumped about this. I reached out to you, it's been a few weeks ago, and I said I'm going to listen to, it's like 50 hours of podcasts that you put out. It's an impressive amount. I went down to Biloxi, Mississippi, and back. It's like 18 hours on the road. I knocked out a bunch then. I finished the last 45 minutes this morning. The show is, with the benefit of hindsight, it's 50 hours, right? 50 hours between you and Liz?
A little bit more than 50 hours with me and my co-host Liz Habib, the former sports anchor at the Fox affiliate here in Los Angeles for about the last 15 years.
Okay, so I am knee deep in this, not like you are, but enough that I remembered what happened because I'm a huge sports fan. But also I've talked to people and they're like, Joe Paterno, Sandusky, I kind of remember something, Paterno died. Let's at a high level before we get into the nuts and bolts of this. And one more reminder, John is free to say whatever he wants. This is a graphic story and tale we're getting into. So if you got kids in the car, hit the eject button now. But John, reset the table. What happened, was it a decade ago now with Joe Paterno, Penn State, and Jerry Sandusky?
Well, part of the reason why we put out the podcast with the benefit of hindsight this year is because this year is the 10th anniversary of probably the biggest sports story, clearly the biggest college sports story so far of this century. And it's known largely as the so-called Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky scandal. And what happened in the public's mind and the media's mind was that in November of 2011, Jerry Sandusky was arrested on numerous counts of child molestation. And within a couple of days of that, the great Joe Paterno, who had just become the winningest coach in the history of college football and who had been at Penn State as the head coach for literally half a century, was unceremoniously fired, as was the president of the university, Grant Spanier, also fired, and two administrators at Penn State, Gary Schultz and Tim Curley, were effectively fired, and they were also indicted in an alleged cover-up. And this was a nuclear bomb that went off not just in Pennsylvania, but throughout the country. And for several years, the ramifications of that story snowballed in one of the biggest scandals, allegedly, that's ever happened in sports, at least here in America. And I realize that 10 years is a long time and that many people have forgotten about this, but my BS detector on this story from the cover-up standpoint, especially regarding Joe Paterno, went off immediately because this story never made any sense. What we were told in November 2011 was that 10 years prior to that, on a date that, by the way, turned out to be wrong, not just once, but I strongly believe twice, a former graduate assistant at Penn State by the name of Mike Mcqueery had supposedly witnessed Jerry Sandusky sexually assaulting, raping what he thought to be a 10-year-old boy in a Penn State shower, told Joe Paterno about it the next morning, and Joe Paterno and Penn State basically effectively did nothing, allowing Jerry Sandusky to go on sexually abusing boys for maybe another 10 years before he was finally arrested. That narrative is bizarre. And let's be clear, bizarre things happen all the time. Strange things happen all the time. O.J. Simpson killed 2 people. That was bizarre. But guess what? There was an enormous amount of evidence that happened. And when you learned more about the story, it actually made some semblance of sense in his world. And so I use the O.J. case because, 1, everyone knows about it, and 2, I've always believed, in fact, the more I've gotten into the Penn State Paterno-Sandusky case, the more I believe that the O.J. case and the Sandusky case are basically polar opposites of each other in almost every way. I mean, they both somewhat deal with football because they were football personalities. But in one situation, O.J. Simpson, there was a mountain of evidence. And the media tried to pretend that there was some question as to whether or not he was guilty because they knew it was good for their ratings and the drama. And OJ was able to use his celebrity and wealth to be able to beat the rap. In this particular situation, everything's the opposite. There was no benefit of the doubt. There was for anybody, and not even Joe Paterno, who certainly deserved it. And there was an immediate rush to judgment in guilt. There was no evidence against anybody. And I was someone who presumed at the start that Jerry Sandusky was guilty. That's where I began my investigation, from that premise. And now, long before now, but certainly now 10 years later, I'm positive that there's no evidence of anyone's guilt because no one did anything wrong. And that in this case, believe it or not, the black hats are being worn by the good guys in the media's perception, and the white hats are being worn by the bad guys. Everything is flipped upside down. And it's all because of a media rush to judgment 10 years ago in the middle of a panic. And I would suggest that the last year and a half, with regard to what's happened to COVID, has shown us that human beings are very prone to coming to false conclusions in the middle of a panic and then being unwilling to reverse themselves because they're invested in a particular narrative. While there's obvious differences, and obviously COVID is real, I think there are a lot of similarities between how the media has handled that story and how the media handled this story. And the bottom line of it is, believe it or not, 5 very good men had their lives destroyed for no good reason. And it's not even close. That's maybe the most amazing part about the whole thing to me, is that this isn't even like a close call. I mean, we've seen many, of these convicted criminals become celebrities, like the Making a Murderer guy, who's guilty as hell, in my opinion. But Netflix makes him into somewhat of a hero because they've been able to raise some doubt about whether or not he really is a murderer. But it's obviously not clear cut, even in Netflix's documentaries perspective. In this situation, it's not even close. It's not even close if you use the rational brain and you look at the facts and you understand how this narrative developed. And I guess maybe the most important thing people need to understand about my perspective on this is I am an anti-conspiracy person. I'm ardently anti-conspiracy in almost every way. Now, there are some small 2-person conspiracies, if you want to call them that, in this story, but there is no large conspiracy. This was a perfect storm of events that all came together in a way that could not be reversed, largely because the media is broken in this country. And it's, again, I can't emphasize enough, it's not even close. And I'm not alone in my belief in this. I've convinced a lot of very, very high profile people people very close to this case. Malcolm Gladwell's last best-selling book, Talking to Strangers, has a chapter about this case in which he uses my work rather liberally and I think effectively, although there's some problems I have with how Malcolm handled the situation. I think he tried to protect himself because I believe he knows that Sandusky is innocent, but he can't say that because it's the third rail. You get destroyed if you say it. Yet we have a lot of prominent people on this podcast, with the benefit of hindsight, who are willing to say publicly that Jerry Sandusky is innocent, including Gary Schultz, in his only interview he's ever done, one of the Penn State administrators who was indicted in this case, and including two former members of the Penn State Board of Trustees who are very high-profile people, very well-respected, very successful business people, Al Lord and Bob Capretto. The founder of the Second Mile Charity, Bruce Heim, who believed that Jerry was guilty when this first hit, has now flipped and now believes very strongly that Jerry is innocent. And there was a book called The Most Hated Man in America by Mark Pendergrass, a very prominent author who was shocked that his book was ignored. Although I told him, your book is going to get ignored because I have been at the front lines of the war on this story. And I know how impossible it is to tell the truth on this, but I'm hardly alone. There are almost, in fact, everybody who has looked at this closely and objectively has come to effectively the same conclusion. They might express it slightly differently because they're afraid of the political ramifications, but this didn't happen. And the only way to make sense of the evidence is that it didn't happen. And to me, I'm amazed you were able to listen to all of the podcasts in a short period of time. So congratulations on that. But to me,
two speed.
but to me, the strength of the podcast, and it has many strengths. It's a remarkable achievement on the part of everybody involved, including our executive producer, Mike Agavino, and Liz Habib, our co-host. But to me, the strength of it is we take these 1,000 puzzle pieces that the media put together in a puzzle that made no damn sense. The pieces don't fit. The picture that they created is all garbled. And we rearrange the puzzle pieces. And I believe that by the end of the podcast, with the benefit of hindsight, most people will go, oh, wow, okay, that version of the puzzle makes a hell of a lot more sense in its totality. And they fit together a heck of a lot better than the fairy tale we were told. So that's a very long synopsis of,
no, it's a 50-hour podcast, so right. It needs a long synopsis. And so for the listeners, you're going to have to go listen to this. We have about 50 minutes left in this podcast, and so we will get to we'll scratch the surface. I will say, I told John this off air. I'll say it on air. After, if you go back and find old posts, which I don't know if you still can or not, I was pretty much, hey, this is terrible. Throw them under the bus. So that was my stance back in 2011, 2010, whatever. I think the podcast for me, you bring out O.J. Simpson. I think that's an interesting parallel. So the O.J. Simpson, and one of the big regrets I have was I was going to get on F. Lee Bailey. I was going to reach out and have him on the podcast, and he died. And I was like, oh, man, I wanted to get him on to talk about this. My read of the O.J. stuff is that O.J. did it. No doubt about it. However, if you believe in justice, and I think this is the point that I want to talk about on the Sandusky thing is, then you have to have a high view of justice, which means you want prosecution standards to be high, the judge standards to be high. Everything in the process needs to be on the up and up. And in the OJ case, it seems that the prosecution at times did things that should allow an acquittal on that basis, not necessarily whether he did or not. And I know, okay, you disagree. We'll have another OJ debate another time. That's fine. But the Sandusky thing, I think that's part of where I would say here. And so let's talk about a couple things. First, let's talk about Mike Mcqueery, because that's kind of the name you might hear. He was the former Penn State quarterback. He kind of broke the story. And what I didn't realize is two things. And so let me talk about my evolution on this as well, is that back when this broke, I was willing to believe that institutions would cover up for things because institutions cover up for things all the time. I wasn't at the point to think about the government being an institution and it covers up or it's inadequate, it's incompetent. I wasn't really open to maybe that idea. And so there's been a lot of things that have happened, as you mentioned, over the past decade that makes you reframe that. But victim number 2. So at trial, there's 10 victims on trial, right? Victim number 2 is Mike Mcqueery, the one that we hear about in the shower. It's terrible. Mike Mcqueery doesn't do anything. He goes talk to Paterno. Paterno doesn't do anything. And Paterno, says when he gets fired, say a little prayer for the victims. And you're like, oh, what is going on here? It like, they have to be guilty. And then you come out and you tell me victim number 2 wasn't at the trial. Victim, what? How? I mean, I know in murder cases you can have a victim with no body, but in this case, this is really weird. Now, there's other victims we got to get to, but victim number 2 is really weird.
Well, thank you for...
And real quick, why were they all tried together? That's something that needs to be talked about as well, because if he's guilty, then fry him. I have no problem with that. But this wasn't, the allegation is not that Jerry Sandusky had 8 to 10 little boys in a room and sexually assaulted them all at one time. It's at different times, which should, in my opinion, require separate trials so you can hear each case on its own merit. But anyways, victim 2, go ahead.
Let me take that last point first, because I agree with you totally from a legal perspective. And I've had conversations with Tom Ezra, who successfully defended Michael Jackson, about this issue. I mean, constitutionally, it makes no sense to me at all. It's not fair. This cumulative effect, and the cumulative effect absolutely was the final nail, the primary nail in Jerry Sandusky's coffin, because I can't tell you how many hundreds of times in the last 10 years, when people are faced with the reality of there being no evidence in this case, their only fallback is, well, they all can't be lying. Well, what if they all got paid millions of dollars? Which happened. Every single one of them got paid millions of dollars. Every single one of them had lawyers and therapists pushing them in this direction. And none of them told a story that made any sense or had any evidence to back it up. Now, I'm glad you put your finger on victim 2, because to me, victim 2 is the whole case. If there was a legitimate victim 2, I probably never would have even gotten involved in this case, even from the perspective of defending Joe Paterno, which is where I began, because the whole thing comes down to Mike Mcqueery. That was 98% of the media narrative when the story broke. This horrible story of Mike Mcqueery allegedly witnessing a boy getting raped in the shower and telling Joe Paterno about it. Well, I would suggest that if this really happened, and by the way, I mean, most people that I speak to understand the absurdity of the idea that Mike Mcqueery saw this and did nothing himself. Right? That's the story. The story is Mike just saw it, went, boy, that's too bad for that kid. I got to get going. And that's not exaggeration. That's his story.
Let me pause you right here, because this, and again, this is graphic. We're going to talk about the other 8 victims in a second, but this is graphic. And it's important to note, this is why we have to think about these terms. And your podcast, I thought, does a good job of this. What he's seeing is not 2 consenting adults having sex with all the pleasures you might hear along with that, right? What he's witnessing is a boy being raped, is his allegation, which means that it's going to be, because you talk about this a lot, there's no allegations of drugs or alcohol. So this would be a boy who is probably in tears, begging for his life, basically. And Mike Mcqueery is the biggest coward to ever walk this planet. That's just so we're clear. That's exactly what happened. If his story is true, if his story is true, just to be clear, when he leaves, he's leaving a boy who was not drugged, who's not unconscious, who's probably there crying for his life. I've got a 13-year-old son begging for his dad or mom or someone to come save him. And Mcqueery, the coward, if his story is true, that's who Mike Mcqueery is. Now, I know you don't believe that, but just so we're clear, everyone get a good hatred for Mike Mcqueery before we go on.
Well, and also to be clear, Mike Mcqueery is, I think he was 27, 28 years old. He's 6'4". He's 225, 30 pounds in tremendous shape. Jerry Sandusky is, I guess, 60 years old. And
he would destroy Jerry Sandusky.
I mean, it's an absurdity. So again, absurd things happen.
Sure,
but there should be evidence. And by the media narrative has always been Mcqueery panicked. Okay, first of all, that's a hell of a panic. This is a guy who played quarterback for a football team that played in front of 100,000 people on national television. Not exactly someone prone to panic. Okay. So, all right. But if this was true, there should be at least two things that go along with this story. Number one is, tell me when it happened. When did it happen? This should be very easy. This is not something you would ever forget. You would mark time by it, especially if Penn State then ended up covering this up and you thought that this poor boy that you saw had been raped at this local legend. This is not a forgettable moment. All right. This is huge if true. And
this scars you for life.
We know for 1,000% certainty, Mcqueery first testified incorrectly about the date, the month, and the year. Okay? He originally testified that this was March 1st, 2002. Occasionally, unbelievably, you'll still see media reports that use the March 1st, 2002 date. Even though before Jerry Sandusky's trial, the prosecution was forced, and the media basically covered this up. I mean, it was reported, but not with trumpets, because when I saw the headline, I'm like, what? What? We were acknowledging the prosecution is that Mike Mcqueery got the date, the month, and the year wrong. They go, oops. Actually, it was February 9th of 2001. So almost 13 months earlier than Mike Mcqueery testified to. And the reason why they knew that was because they got emails. Now, they got emails from Gary Schultz, one of the administrators who was indicted, who's done an interview with me, done two of them for about 4 hours in total. You can find them. They're amazing at our website, framingpaterno.com. And this was not some sort of a cover-up. He voluntarily gave these emails up when he found them after the crap had hit the fan. And so they no longer could stand by the March 1st, 2002 date. But they were locked into the February 9th date. Why? Not because there was independent evidence of February 9th, not because they found cell phone records of Mike Mcqueery calling his dad that night, which is what his story is. That would be evidence, right? If there was a phone call, if there was a cell phone record of Mike Mcqueery calling his dad's cell phone at like 9:45 on the evening of February 9th of 2001, I would go, okay, interesting. That's evidence. I need more, but that's evidence. That's never been produced. No, the reason why February 9th becomes the date is because they know Mike goes to see Joe Paterno the morning of February 10th. They know that via emails. If Mike doesn't go to see Joe the next morning, there's no urgency. And if there's no urgency, Mike didn't see a rape, because everybody knows you don't. First of all, if you really see a rape, you beat the shit out of Jerry Sandusky and you immediately go to the police. You don't wait the next morning to go see Joe Paterno. But if you give Mike Mcqueery every possible benefit of the doubt, he panics. He goes and talks to his dad, and Dr. Dranoff, his dad's friend, and his dad's friend testifies 3 times that Mike told him he never saw a sex act, which is incredibly important. But if you give Mike every benefit,
you said he tells his dad and who?
Dr. Dranoff, his dad's friend.
And so that's a DR doctor, which would mean that the DR doctor has to do what if he heard of this?
He's a mandated reporter. He's a mandated reporter if Mike tells him he saw a sex act. And Dranoff testified numerous times that 3 times he asked Mike, did you see a sex act? And Mike said no. And that's all on the record. And so if we give Mike every benefit of the doubt, he waits to the next morning to go see Joe Paterno. That's the best the prosecution can do. They know that if there's more than a delay of the next morning, then I'm sorry, no one's buying that Mike Mcqueery saw a rape. Now, both my biggest mistake, and I've made many, and my greatest success, I haven't had that many, in this case are over the same episode, which is I now know what the real date was. And Malcolm Gladwell has documented this in his book, Talking to Strangers. My mistake was I should have been able to figure this out a lot sooner than I did. I was probably the only person in a position, although I will say that Jerry Sandusky and his attorney, Joe Amendola, should have been able to figure this out on their own. But they're morons. But of the people not in that group, I was probably the only person privy to all the information because I had interviewed Jerry Sandusky in prison extensively. I'd spoken to Amendola. I knew the story of victim 2. I should have been more skeptical because when I interviewed Jerry Sandusky in prison the first time back in 2013, I came out of there, first of all, with my head spinning. But I was positive of one thing more than any other of the hundreds of things that we had discussed. And that is that Jerry Sandusky knew in his bones that the February 9th, 2001 date, the second Mcqueery date, was still wrong. And I should have trusted that. But remember, I'm thinking Jerry's a serial pedophile and that nothing he's saying can be taken at face value. But I knew in his bones he believed that date was not correct. Now, why he couldn't figure out what the real date was and why it took me to do it and why I unfortunately tabled that investigation for years when it could have theoretically mattered is all a mystery to me. But frankly, my great mistake was that I trusted that the prosecution couldn't possibly have screwed this up so catastrophically twice, but they did. The real date of this episode that was not a rape of a boy in the shower was on December 29th of 2000. And we know this for a myriad of reasons. We deal with it extensively in our first episode of With the Benefit of Hindsight. And again, it's documented in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers. And what then happens is there's a 6-week delay from the time that Mcqueery sees what he saw in the shower for 3 seconds by his own testimony and tells Joe Paterno about it. And something happens which triggers Mike Mcqueery going to see Joe Paterno. And it's not seeing a rape in the shower on February 9th. It's learning on February 9th that the job he wanted desperately as a graduate assistant, the Kenny Jackson wide receivers coaching position, had just opened up because Jackson took a job with the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's why Mike Mcqueery went to go see, primarily, why he went to go see Joe Paterno on that Saturday morning. And we know, and by the way, the Kenny Jackson job is so important in so many ways. Number one, it's the real motivation for why he goes to see Joe Paterno. Number two, it blows up the cover-up theory because in a cover-up, the first thing that would happen is that Joe Paterno would say, wow, Mike, whew, that's horrible. Thanks so much for coming to us with this information. By the way, keep it to yourself. And congratulations, you're our new wide receivers coach. And that's what would happen. None of that happened. Mike didn't get the job.
Yeah, real quick, just because you made the point several times on the podcast, and it's important. I think if you've been around sports or you're thinking about in terms of a cover-up, it makes sense. But if you're just kind of casually listening, you might miss it. What you're saying is if Mcqueery saw something, he's a grad assistant, which is bottom of the barrel on a college football coaching staff. He wants a real job. He now has leverage over the great Joe Paterno. He comes to Joe Paterno and says, I need a job. Oh, by the way, I saw this. If Paterno says no, okay, and Paterno is going to cover for Sandusky, so those two things are going to happen, which is what we're saying. He says no to the job, and he's going to cover for Sandusky. Then he's got Mcqueery loose in the wind here, who could blow his cover at any time. Theoretically, that's what you're alleging.
Exactly. And by the way, he can go to the media. He could get another job at another school and then blow the whistle. I mean, there are all sorts of problems here. And thank you for understanding the nature of the graduate assistant position. I think that's one of the many things that the media and the public did not understand. You are a nobody. I mean, you are effectively a glorified intern. Mm-hmm. And so Mike Mike does not get the job. But just to be clear, because you might be thinking, well, maybe he didn't want that job, maybe he wasn't qualified for it. He ends up getting that job 3 years later when it opens up a second time.
Yeah.
So this is clearly a job that he wanted, that he felt he was qualified for, that he eventually even Paterno decided he was qualified for. But you do not leave if you're running a cover-up. I mean, come on. Joe Paterno is a good Italian. I'm sure he's watched plenty of mafia movies. The last thing you do with your only witness of a cover-up is to let him hang in there without even a job. So it's an absurdity. And again, I don't want to waste all the time explaining why I know December 29th is the date. By the way, now Jerry Sandusky himself has finally said, oh gosh, yeah, I guess that was the date. Gary Schultz now believes that was the date. This 6-week delay is devastating to the entire narrative. Now, the second thing you would demand if this story was true, I said the first is, when did it happen? And they fail catastrophically on that point. The second thing you would demand in an evidence-based world is, okay, who was the boy? Now, in a normal case, 10 years later, I could understand not being able to theoretically find the boy. That would be weird, but it would be possible. Maybe the boy's afraid. He doesn't want to admit that he was raped. I get all that. I am incredibly understanding of alleged victims. You want to say something?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I want to say something because yes, all those things you say are true. He could be embarrassed. He could be ashamed. He could be, scarred for life. That could all be true. However, the problem here is, and this is what I'm talking about a retrial, this is to be clear, is that when you're saying that John saw Ryan do X, and John's the only witness in the world, and it's the only real evidence is an eyewitness, and there's no other evidence of a crime, that is a standard that a society cannot function under. Now, if John saw Ryan murder someone and that body is missing, maybe that's one thing. But in this case, we're going off of Mike Mcqueery saying he saw something horrific that they all should burn the pit of hell if it's true. No one's denying that. Right. But how do you know Mike Mcqueery is telling the truth? And that, when I talk about the burden at the court level, that's all I'm referring to is that, and you document the podcast that this guy wrote letters. He drove 10 hours to.
Well, I want to get there. I mean, I want to get there, but I think your point is a valid one. But let me just take it another step. So, in my never-ending efforts to be understanding of alleged accusers or victims and the prosecution, I give them every benefit of the doubt. But this is not a normal case, and this cannot be emphasized enough. There is zero chance that the boy in the shower has not heard that Jerry Sandusky has been arrested, right? In a normal case, that's possible. In this case, it's not, because it is the biggest story in the nation for a long time. And so unless victim 2 is dead, which would be highly unusual, because by Mike Mcqueery's account, he's 20 years old, although he's actually a little bit older than that because Mcqueery got the age wrong by about 3 years. So there's no chance, zero chance that he doesn't, the boy in the shower doesn't know that Jerry has been arrested. And also there's two other things here. Jerry has lost all presumption of innocence. He's lost all power. There's nobody defending him. So there's no fear that somehow you're going to be maligned as a victim of Jerry Sandusky. You're being given anonymity. I mean, no one's name is being made public. The media is protecting the accusers with everything they possibly have in ways that, in my view, made the entire case dysfunctional. And then there's a final element that makes this case unique. Penn State has made it very, very clear immediately that millions and millions of dollars are on the table. So if you are the boy in the shower, you know for sure Jerry has been arrested. You know that he's going down and that you're going to be protected. And you know that there are millions of dollars in this for you to tell your story. So therefore, the idea that you can't find the boy in the shower is preposterous. And the prosecution told the jury in closing arguments that the identity of the boy in the shower, so-called victim number 2, is known only to God. That's a quote. Only to God. That was not just not true. That was a lie. They knew who the boy, or at least they absolutely should have known who the boy in the shower was. He's a guy by the name of Alan Myers, who was 13 years old, almost 14 years old at the time of this episode on December 29th of 2000. And his words, and more importantly, his actions make it absolutely impossible in a rational world to believe that he was ever abused by Jerry Sandusky in any sort of way. In fact, I don't think you could concoct, if you tried, a profile of persona, of words, and of actions that are more inconsistent with somebody who was sexually abused by Jerry Sandusky. You already alluded to some of that. I don't know if you want me to go through the list or not, but he did not testify at trial. No one testified at trial as victim number 2, not because they didn't know who he was, but because the prosecution did not like his story. Because by that point, he had already made his story very public in letters to the editor in 2 different newspapers in Pennsylvania, as well as in a police interview in September of 2011, in which he ended the interview by saying, "I think you're trying to get me to lie about Jerry Sandusky. I will never say anything bad about Jerry Sandusky." Those are the words of Alan Myers. We now know, because he's the only person who ever claimed to be the boy in the shower. And after the trial, he got paid, I think it was almost $8 million for his story, even though he never testified at trial. So, when
did he come out?
Story,
when did Alan Myers become public as victim number 2? How long after the
right after the trial?
Right, like a month later.
Right after the trial.
Right. So he
was, I think, a month at most. A month.
Yeah. So just to set the table. I was going to say, just a table. We're listening. Yeah. Real quick, my argument is we have to have a retrial because we have to have a high standard of justice. Here you have a guy testifying for a victim that doesn't exist. Oh, by the way, there's all kinds of things. Your podcast does a great job of him defending Sandusky. And as soon as the trial ends, he comes public, and then gets paid by Penn State. So his testimony is critical for the Sandusky trial, and now we know who he is. So if he's willing to get paid, then he should be willing to testify. And the other thing is, I wasn't clear about this in the podcast. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time here, but I'm curious. Did he testify at one of the appeals? Is that what you said at the podcast? And what did he say there? Because I wasn't sure.
Okay, so the real story of Alan Myers is just amazing, and the media has been amazingly uncurious about who the boy in the shower is. When Myers came out as victim 2 through his attorneys about a month after the trial, not one that I could ever find, not one media outlet even asked, so why didn't he testify? Where's the testimony? That was never even an issue, which should be the first question. Instead, because by that point Jerry Sandusky is a convicted pedophile, there's zero question that anyone that comes forward in any way must be telling the truth. When I believe what actually happened here is that Alan Myers knew he was not sexually abused by Jerry Sandusky, was convinced by his attorney, Andrew Shubin, for whom his mother once worked as a secretary. And Shubin is this DUI attorney at State College who's campaigning and advertising for Sandusky accusers, and ends up representing at least 9 of them, making millions and millions of dollars for the umbrella law firm Ross Feller Casey. And that, by the way, that Casey is the brother of the senator from Pennsylvania, Bob Casey. And so a very high-profile, high-powered law firm that Shubin is basically acting as a bird dog scout for. And so Shubin, what I believe happened is he makes a deal with Myers and says, look, I know you don't want to put, I don't think they said these words, but I think it was a dance. I know you don't want to put your friend behind bars. Jerry's going down. He's a pedophile. But look, you don't have to testify. But afterwards, let's go ahead and make some money from this. By the way, and the testimony that you referred to, Myers eventually did testify years later at one of Jerry Sandusky's appeal hearings, in which his answer to the question, where were you during the trial, is, I don't remember. And this is when hit with the allegation that was based on substance that Shubin had hid him in a cabin so no one could find him during the trial, because he was afraid, I think Shubin was, that before the trial, the defense found Myers and forced him to testify that Alan might actually tell the truth and blow the money. Now, I was at Alan Myers' testimony in 2016 at Jerry Sandusky's appeal hearing, and it was a farce. I believe he said, I don't remember, at least 33, 34 times, things that were ridiculous that he had no memory of. He could not remember where the picture of him in his Marine uniform and Jerry Sandusky arm in arm had been taken. It was taken at his wedding, which is an absurdity that you don't know that. By the way, that photo was used in Jerry Sandusky's resignation letter from the Second Mile Charity, which is an awfully strange thing to do for a criminal mastermind. If you're Jerry Sandusky, to, in your resignation letter from the Second Mile Charity, which has been your source of all your victims, that you're going to use the photo of one Second Mile kid and use the name of one Second Mile kid. And it happens to be Alan Myers, the kid you raped in a shower, witnessed by Mike Mcqueery. Now, come on. Not only is that ridiculous, there's no way that you can be a criminal mastermind and do that. That didn't happen because Alan Myers was never sexually abused by Jerry Sandusky, period.
So let's go to the other victim that I think, again, to remind the listener, Sandusky was tried collectively for all of these in their individual counts, but the evidence is being presented all at one trial, which is the problem here. So if you want to say he's guilty for all the ones I'm not talking about, you can have that discussion. My argument is, though, when you look at justice, you got to think about it in terms of what is the just thing, and these things are unjust from my perspective. Is the janitor story? Okay, so now let me set the table here for make sure I'm right. There is a gentleman who testifies at the trial that his friend, who's another janitor, saw a boy getting raped in a shower. Okay, so Bob, whatever his name was, I can't remember his name, Tom or something like that, who's at trial, he did not see it. His friend saw it. His friend cannot testify because he has dementia now. The only evidence that we have linking any of this to Sandusky is potentially the Mike Mcqueery episode, you could say. But the problem is that the guy, when he gives the janitor with dementia, he says it wasn't Sandusky, right? So he says for some reason it wasn't Sandusky. So it's weird. So this should not be at trial. It's hearsay, it seems like to me. I'm not a lawyer. It seems like hearsay, A. B, here you have, again, grown men witnessing something horrific, not doing anything. This was just a train wreck story. When you started telling it, I'm like, what is going, like, how is this presented as evidence at trial? This sounds like, you've seen the show Prison Break, like they're always trying to get their appeals and the judge is being paid off. Like, this sounds like that. Like, how is this allowed as evidence?
Thank you for raising the gender issue because it doesn't get nearly enough attention. The gender issue alone, well, it's not as important as the query episode. So the gender issue, how this isn't enough for a new trial, I have no idea. The genders have been used by the news media and by Louis Freeh, who did the Freeh report about all this, as major evidence of a Penn State cover-up, that even the janitors were so intimidated. I mean, the janitors did not work for Joe Paterno. And there's no evidence that Joe Paterno ever fired any janitors or anything like that. But the narrative was that the janitors were somehow so afraid of the Penn State football culture that they covered up this sex abuse that they had witnessed on an unknown date, sometime around the year 2000. and during football season, apparently. And so there are so many problems with this. So let me just go through them quickly. The alleged direct witness is a guy by the name of James Calhoun. As you said, James Calhoun did not testify at trial. Now, the way the prosecution got this story into evidence without a witness or without a victim was that they claimed that through an excited utterance exemption, that hearsay evidence should be allowed. And they told the judge, who was completely in the tank for the prosecution, they told the judge, we have two janitors that are willing to testify that James Calhoun told them that he had seen Jerry Sandusky abusing a boy in the locker area. All right? Now, that's a problem legally, right off the bat. But the problems are far greater than even that. Number one, the second janitor never testifies at trial. So they got it into evidence based on a lie. Now, what happened to that second janitor? I don't know. I'm very curious as to why that second janitor did not testify. But I can assure you it's not because the prosecution was very confident that he was going to be a good witness. Number two, the witness who does testify, the hearsay witness, changes the location. He changes the location in which this occurred, which should be very troubling for an episode without a victim, without a date, without a contemporaneous report, and where you're a hearsay witness of something that happened at least 10 years earlier. But then, well after conviction, we learn, and maybe Joe Mendola, Jerry Sandusky's defense attorney's most dramatic mistake in the entire trial, although it's hard to pick because there's a lot. But maybe his most obvious mistake is that we learn that, guess what? The prosecution did interview James Calhoun, the alleged direct witness to this episode. And guess what? He was asked, who did he see? He was asked 3 times. And 3 times he denied emphatically that it was Jerry Sandusky. He said clear as day, it was not Jerry Sandusky I saw. Now, this is a theory of mine, but I think it makes sense. Because if you think about this logically, if James Calhoun, the prosecution believes he has dementia, why are they interviewing him to begin with? Because his testimony has no value if he has dementia. What I think happened is they interviewed him, didn't get the answers that they wanted, and said, thank you very much, Mr. Calhoun. Sorry about your dementia. That's what happened. And then somehow they convinced Joe Amendola, Joe, don't you dare use the interview of this poor dementia victim against him. And Joe, for some reason, went along with it. So the jury never saw that there was the only interview that I'm aware of, anyone's aware of, with James Calhoun on the record saying it was not Jerry Sandusky. So you have no direct witness. The direct witness contradicts the only hearsay witness. And again, there's no date, there's no contemporaneous report, and there's no victim to testify. I mean, I'm sorry. If you tried, and by the way, the hearsay witness changes the location of the details. If you tried to concoct a scenario that was more full of bullshit, I don't think you possibly could. And yet, to show you the inherently illegitimate nature of this Salem witch trial, Jerry Sandusky was convicted on all 5 counts with regard to the janitor issue. He wasn't even convicted of all 5 counts on the Mcqueery episode. But that's how insane this was. And so thank you for raising the janitor thing, because it's unbelievable.
Okay, so the pushback I will give there is, I heard you make the point about Paterno and the janitors. That, I don't think that works. So I think if you're there, I don't care where the org chart says Joe Pye is. If you piss off Joe Pye, he can, you at least think he can get you fired. Now, I'm not saying that makes you cover up sexual abuse or any of that, but I do think the janitors at Alabama, no, they piss off Saban. It doesn't matter what the org chart says.
Okay.
They're going to be
To
fired.
be clear, Jerry Sandusky was Jerry Sandusky was not even on the Penn State staff at this time, at the Mcqueery episode or the janitor episode. All right, so the
Understood.
whole concept is preposterous.
Right. Yeah,
I mean,
no, I don't think.
So
I don't think
the reason I raised.
I was just say I don't think it takes me to the larger point, but I do think it is fair to believe the janitors are concerned about their job. That doesn't justify their inaction. So here's the problem. Here's one of the things.
All I'm mentioning is that there was no technical power from Paterno to do that, nor any evidence. See, that's why I raised the issue.
Yeah, sure.
There's no evidence that Paterno ever abused his power to get rid of janitors or other people that he didn't like. There's no evidence of that.
Sure. So how do we think about this? This is one of the questions I walked away with is you have Mcqueery and you have the janitors. Neither should be admissible at trial, I don't think. And I think it's alone enough to get Sandusky a retrial. But what do you do with those two stories, which they're not identical, but you have one with a boy being raped in the shower potentially from Mcqueery, and you have these janitors who are different time, potentially different place, but they have a similar story. Is this a randomness of events, or how do we get those two stories at trial? I think that's a fair question someone could ask.
In other words, you're asking me what really happened, and so
Sure.
so here's what I think. Here's what I think really happened. I think that Mike Mcqueery saw for 2 or 3 seconds Jerry Sandusky horsing around with a 13-year-old boy he thought to be his son in the shower. It upset him because he was not expecting to see that. It happened on December 29th, which is about as quiet a day as you can possibly find on campus. Mike Mcqueery, I believe, had just been watching the Peach Bowl on television, was bored, went over to the locker room. He heard the showers going. He heard some slapping sounds. I believe he went in to that area. Something he even did. Other people say that where he was, it's not even possible to see what he claims. But I believe he was suspecting that a man and a woman were having sex in the shower. That's what he was expecting to see. And I can certainly understand if that was your expectation. You turn the corner and all of a sudden you see Jerry Sandusky horsing around with a naked boy. That would be very upsetting. And I have no problem with that making you uncomfortable. I have no problem with you raising a question about that, telling people about it. I have zero issue with any of that. And I believe that that's what happened. I believe that it got eventually passed up the food chain, very tentatively so. I have some detailed explanations for why Mike Mcqueery, from both an offensive and defensive perspective and his own self-interest, waited 6 weeks to tell Joe Paterno about this. But I don't believe that there was any sort of a crime that Mike Mcqueery witnessed. And his own testimony is consistent with that, because he never says that he saw an actual sex act. He called it sexual. He never tells us what sex act he's talking about. He says he did not see penetration. He told Franco Harris, Pro Football Hall of Famer, at Joe Paterno's funeral, and when an interview that we have, you can find FrancoPaterno.com. It's extraordinary, where Franco basically puts his last of truth around Mike Mcqueery and comes away convinced that Mike Mcqueery didn't see anything of a sexual nature. Asking him very detailed questions about what he saw and what he didn't see. And so I think that was an episode that was at worst something that was dumb and inappropriate for Jerry to be doing alone on a Friday night in the middle of winter break with a 13-year-old boy. I think it's now seen through the prism of the Catholic Church scandal, which hadn't happened publicly yet in the year 2000. And so I think our sensibilities are a bit biased now. And we look at that as far more nefarious than we would have in maybe 2000. So I don't believe that there was any crime at all in that episode. Now, as far as the janitors, what I think happened was that these prosecutors were desperate for something to back up Mcqueery. And so they started asking anybody and everybody around the program, did you hear anything, see anything? Is there anything at all that made you uncomfortable? And my guess is Calhoun may have seen some sort of an act. Who knows? He might have seen a gay sex act involving somebody else from many years before, and who knows what his recollection is. But the prosecution is now making it clear they're in the market for sex abuse stories involving Jerry Sandusky. And so somehow through the whisper down the lane, this turns into something that it was not. And Calhoun on record says it wasn't Jerry Sandusky. Who knows what it was? Again, I have not spoken to Calhoun. Maybe he does have some semblance of dementia, but the reality is there's no evidence of it, and the story doesn't make sense, and the story doesn't hold up, and it doesn't even have a victim, which again in this case is absurd. In this case, it's absurd that you can't find the victim because of all the circumstances I already discussed.
Yep. And so that's my challenge to the listener is, I think from my perspective, whatever you want to think about all the other victims, and you've got 50 hours of podcasts that deal with this, the stance of a retrial is not controversial because I feel like I've raised 2 cases in which they were tried under one trial that shouldn't have been there, and it prejudices the jury, and therefore you should get a retrial. So for the listeners who are like, oh, I can't, listen, there's some stuff that Sandusky does that I'm not sure I can get there with you, John. I think your podcast is very compelling, but I think a retrial at minimum from the evidence just we talked about on this podcast and your podcast is the only logical conclusion that you could come to. Some people will go further to where you're at. But I think starting here gives a window into, I didn't realize that there was problems at trial like this. There's problems in the testimony, problems in the evidence. And once you realize that, if you care about justice, which I keep going back to, then you have to say we need a retrial. Now, maybe the result will be the rest of the victims come forward. I don't know, but I think that's the only proper step. Now, the biggest miss on the podcast, and this is unquestionable, the biggest miss on your podcast is that you said, and I quote, Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. That, sir, is not true. I mean, no. You said it. Yeah. You said he killed himself. No. That is not true. That is not true. Jeffrey Epstein was murdered in jail. So I don't know how you can come to that conclusion based upon your covering of this trial.
Well, Jeffrey Epstein did kill himself, and the reason why we know that is because, have you ever been in a federal prison before?
No, I have not been in one.
Okay, so if you're in a federal prison, everyone knows exactly who is in there at any moment. And so therefore, at that time of night, you would have the most limited list of suspects of that crime in the history of crimes. And therefore, for that to go unsolved would require an extraordinary conspiracy for which there is no apparent motivation nor any evidence of it. So you're making if you have evidence of it, I'm all ears. You have a incredibly high threshold, and so if you think that that's somehow discrediting, then that's your problem. I want to make one last point, though.
Well, I'm giving you a hard time more than anything. We can have the Epstein discussion another day, but go ahead.
Well, no, but look, it's important to point out that yes, we've destroyed these 2 of the 10 episodes. There are 8 other episodes or 8 other accusers that actually did testify at trial, and every single one of them, to varying degrees, has massive problems. And if you don't believe Mike Mcqueery, and you don't believe victim number 1 in this case, Aaron Fisher, then you cannot believe the rest, because everything flows from those 2 stories. Those are the pillars of the entire case. It is absolutely, basically mathematically impossible for Aaron Fisher to be lying, him being the only accuser for 2 years in this investigation. And then they get Mike Mcqueery fall in their lap. And basically what they do is they have a hook and a bait, and they go fishing in this pond of second mile kids who are now adults. I mean, let's not forget that. These are all adults when they testify at Jerry Sandusky's trial, and most of them have had terrible lives. Most of them have come from broken homes. That's why they were in the second mile to begin with. They've got marital issues, money issues. And so this is a pond that it's incredibly easy to go fishing in and find a handful. And that's all they found, which is kind of amazing. It's a remarkable testament to the loyalty to Jerry Sandusky that they could only find 8 of these guys to go with at trial, considering the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews that they did fishing for potential accusers. And Aaron Fisher is not telling the truth. I've had over a dozen on the record interviews with people very, very close to Aaron Fisher with no reason. In fact, family members of his, including his soon-to-be ex-wife, Mallory Fisher, who have raised grave questions about his story. And so Mcqueery's not telling the truth. Fisher's not telling the truth. Inherently, all the other stories then are not believable. But if you go through each of them individually, they all have their own massive problems. And I just want to make sure that that's clear. And then the ultimate, and this is, I guess I'm amazed that you're positive that Epstein didn't kill himself, but yet you're somehow still believing that Jerry Sandusky abused young boys when we provided the medical evidence that just wasn't possible.
No,
and that's a huge bombshell in the podcast.
That is a bombshell. To be clear, my stance is there's a proverb that says that one side sounds good until you hear the other. And so what I'm articulating is that regardless of what anyone else wants to say, the basis for victim 2 and whatever the genitors was, 8 or 10, I can't remember, that alone is cause for a mistrial. So we can have a discussion about the gonads being shrunken and all this other stuff. That's all fine and dandy. But these 2 things alone are cause for a retrial. Now,
right. What I'm saying is the fact that we now know from his medical records that during at least 2 of the key allegations, and probably for most of it, not his entire life, Jerry Sandusky effectively had no testicles. Sure. Makes it absolutely physically impossible for many of these acts to have occurred. But even more than that, totally impossible for all of these men to have had intimate sexual contact with Jerry Sandusky, and nobody mentioned this, even though it was a golden ticket to millions of dollars.
Okay, we're at an hour. You got 2 more minutes because I know we're up against the clock here. So yes, just to be clear, the point that you make in the podcast about the boy who claims to be raped 100 times, and it's brutal, and there's no evidence ever found. The gonad testimony, that's very compelling. The changing of the stories is very compelling. I'm trying to think. There was one other thing in there off the top of my head that it's like 50 hours. So yeah, I don't have it all memorized like you do. There's plenty of compelling things. I remember where I was coming back from Mississippi when I heard the gonad stuff, and I was just like, what is going on here? Like, this is unbelievable. 2 victims at the same time. And so then the 8-year sting operation, there's 50 hours of podcast. I had an hour. I want to pick on these 2 things because I think I can make an argument for a retrial on that alone. I had to think about all of the other things, Sarah Gannon and just her, and just it's a mess. It's a hot mess is what it is. And your podcast is fantastic. It's with the benefit of hindsight. The website is framingpaterno.com. At what you had on Twitter, at Zygmunt Freud. At Zygmunt Freud on Twitter. Thank you for doing this. It's fantastic. Enjoy the podcast. Enjoy the discussion. When you do, with the benefit of hindsight, why I was wrong about Epstein, I look forward to coming on that podcast and talking with you about that.
Fair enough.
And listeners, thank you so much, and we'll be back next time.